Picture a solar panel. You're picturing something heavy, rigid, glass and metal, bolted to a roof, or spread across a field. Now forget all of it, because the thing at the center of this story looks like a sheet of camera film, thin enough to roll up in your hand, light enough to tape to a window, flexible enough to wrap around a pillar. And it makes electricity from sunlight, just like the panel on your roof, except it can go where that panel never could. Here's the part that turns this from a science story into something much bigger. Japan invented this technology. Then it watched China build the world's solar industry while its own leadership disappeared. Now Japan is betting its future on one last chance to win that race back with a strip of film. So why would one of the most advanced nations on Earth stake its energy future on a material so fragile the first version died in minutes, and on an industry it already lost once? To understand why Japan thinks it can win this fight, you first have to understand why it lost, and why the thing it lost to was so hard to beat. So here's the obvious question. If a solar panel could really be this thin and this light, why don't we already have it? For decades, solar panel has meant one thing: silicon. Stiff wafers sealed beneath glass, locked inside metal frames, heavy, expensive, built for rooftops and vast open fields. It wasn't glamorous, but year after year, it simply kept working. And here's what most people assume: that we're stuck with silicon because nobody thought of anything better. That's wrong. They did think of something better, repeatedly. For years, there was always another contender waiting in the wings, a material that promised to be thinner, lighter, and much cheaper to make. On paper, it looked like the future of solar, and every single time it fell apart. Literally, it couldn't survive the ordinary things a solar panel lives in: sunlight, open air, a humid afternoon. The dream kept dying in the lab. So silicon didn't become the world's standard because it was elegant, light, or revolutionary. It became the standard because year after year, decade after decade, it simply refused to fail. Everything else did. And slowly, the thin, flexible dream got quietly filed away under 3 words. Nice idea, doesn't work. For years, that was the end of the story. The rule everyone accepted, and nobody bothered to question anymore. Then, something changed. The material that had spent decades failing suddenly began improving faster than any solar technology in history. And it started with the discovery almost nobody noticed at the time. So what was the discovery? What could possibly turn the material that always failed into something worth trillions of yen? It has a name most people have never heard: Perovskite. It isn't a brand, it's a completely different way of making a solar cell. While silicon has to be carved from rock and purified at blistering, energy-hungry temperatures, perovskite can be mixed into a liquid and printed onto thin film, almost like ink rolling onto newspaper. That's the secret behind paper thin. Perovskite absorbs sunlight so efficiently that the working layer can be just a fraction of the thickness of a human hair, roughly 20 times thinner than a silicon panel. Now here's the moment that changed everything. When scientists first demonstrated perovskite, it converted less than 4% of sunlight into electricity. Compared with silicon, it wasn't even close. But then something extraordinary happened. Year after year, the efficiency kept climbing. Within roughly 15 years, perovskite had caught up with silicon, a rate of improvement no solar technology had ever achieved before. And it didn't stop there. Layered on top of silicon, perovskite shattered an efficiency ceiling physicists had treated as untouchable for over 60 years. So think about what this means. A material that's thinner than silicon, cheaper to manufacture, and now just as efficient, or in some cases, even better. Which forces the obvious question: if it's really this good, why isn't it already on every roof on Earth? Because there was still one problem, the same problem that had nearly killed the technology from the very beginning. So there it was, the material that used to die in minutes. Perovskite's weakness was never strength. It was never efficient. It was survival. Everything impressive about this material meant nothing. Couldn't stay alive outdoors. Think about where a solar panel has to spend its entire life. Out in the open, scorching summers, freezing winters, rain, humid air, day after day, year after year. Those aren't unusual conditions. They're exactly what a solar panel is built to survive. For perovskite, they're exactly what tears it apart at the molecular level. The first working cell lasted minutes. Early panels lost their power in weeks. Now consider the difference. A silicon panel is expected to keep generating electricity for 25 years. For a long time, Perovskite couldn't promise 25 days. You don't change the outdoors. You protect the material from it. Japanese engineers wrapped the fragile Perovskite in protective sealing layers, a barrier that keeps moisture and oxygen out while still letting sunlight through. Here's the honest truth. This problem isn't fully solved. Perovskite still ages faster than silicon, and no version has yet matched silicon's 25-year track record. But lasts minutes became lasts years. And that was the moment a lab curiosity became something real. Fine. Say you've solved the survival problem. There's still one thing standing between a lab and a power grid. A lab cell is the size of a fingernail. A country needs them by the mile. And this is exactly where most breakthroughs quietly die. A material can look flawless inside a laboratory, then fall apart the moment you try to make it bigger. That perfect little square becomes a streaky, defect-riddled sheet. And with every tiny flaw, the performance begins to disappear. Perovskite makes that even harder because it isn't cut, it's grown. Coat it a little too fast or a little too unevenly across a wide sheet, and the crystals form wrong. The efficiency craters. So the real race was no longer about discovering the material. It was about learning how to print it. And here's the image to hold on to. Picture a newspaper press, giant rolls of paper racing through the machine, ink stamped across every inch, thousands of pages pouring out the other side. Now imagine the paper isn't becoming tomorrow's headlines. It's becoming a solar panel. That's roll-to-roll manufacturing. A continuous sheet of Perovskite film unspooling through the factory like a press printing electricity instead of newspapers. Japan's Sekisui Chemical has taken this technology out of the laboratory and onto a real factory floor, backed by a billion-dollar government subsidy. It's not finished. The film is still narrow. The yields are still climbing. But the road from the beaker to the factory now exists. So the material survives the weather. It can finally be manufactured at scale. And for the first time, it can genuinely challenge silicon, which leaves the strangest question of all. Why is Japan, of all countries, betting everything on this? Because this story was never really about the panel. It was about Japan all along. So why Japan? Of all the countries that could chase this, why is this the one betting everything? To understand that, go back 20 years. In 2004, Japan didn't just lead the solar industry. It produced nearly half of the world's solar panels. Today, Japan makes less than 1%. Let that sink in. From half the world to almost nothing. China scaled silicon faster and cheaper than anyone believed possible, and Japan watched the industry it built slip offshore and disappear. This wasn't just another new technology. It was a technology invented in Japan. The country that lost the first solar revolution now believes it has a chance to lead the second. Because this time, Japan holds a card China can't simply outbuild. Perovskite runs on iodine, and Japan sits on one of the largest iodine reserves on Earth, locked in ancient underground brine formed over millions of years. Here's the part that changes everything. You can build a silicon factory with enough money. You cannot create an iodine deposit. That advantage was written into the landscape millions of years ago, and it favors Japan. Then there's the land itself. Japan is mountainous, crowded, almost out of open ground for solar farms. But it has endless walls, windows, towers. The very geography that made heavy silicon a poor fit makes paper-thin solar a perfect one. A country with nowhere to lay panels down could stand them up instead and turn its own cities into power. Plants invented here, powered by a resource buried here, built for the kind of space this country has in abundance. It's not just a solar panel, it's a nation trying to reclaim the future it watched slip away. So if every piece fits this perfectly, why hasn't it happened yet? Because the dream is running ahead of the facts, and the facts are more complicated than the headlines suggest. Start with the hardest one. Perovskite still doesn't last as long as silicon. A silicon panel is built to pass a punishing test, still working after 25 years outdoors. Perovskite hasn't cleared that bar. It still fades faster, and the long-term track record simply isn't there yet. The very fragility we talked about earlier hasn't vanished. It's been managed, not erased. Then there's the obstacle almost every new technology runs into: Cost. Early perovskite is expected to be several times more expensive than silicon, and by Japan's own government projections, it may still not undercut silicon on price, even by 2040. And then there's one final twist. Those record-breaking solar cells, the ones that outperform silicon, usually aren't made from perovskite alone. They're built by stacking perovskite on top of silicon. In other words, the technology everyone calls silicon's replacement still depends on silicon to reach its greatest performance. So the idea that perovskite will make silicon obsolete turns out to be the wrong way to think about it. This isn't simply a replacement, it's a partner and a challenger, a way to bring solar to places silicon was never designed to reach, while silicon continues doing what it already does well. Which leaves one final question. Japan may have invented the technology, it may have the resources, it may even have the manufacturing, but is that enough to change an industry the rest of the world has already built around silicon? Maybe not, because beyond cost and durability, there are three more obstacles the excitement skips right over. The first is uncomfortable. It contains lead. The most efficient perovskites rely on a small amount of lead, a toxic metal. And if moisture reaches a damaged cell, that's exactly the kind of scenario environmental regulators worry about. Lead-free versions do exist. They're just not as efficient, at least not yet. The second is a quiet contradiction. Perovskite is famous for looking like a sheet of film you could curl up in one hand. But many of the versions durable enough to sell today are sealed behind rigid glass. The dream hasn't disappeared. The commercial reality just hasn't caught up to it yet. The third may matter most. China isn't standing still. The same manufacturing giants that overwhelmed Japan in silicon are already investing heavily in perovskite at a scale and speed Japan may struggle to match. Japan's resource advantage is real, but resources alone have never decided who wins an industry. None of this makes perovskite a failure. Great technologies rarely succeed because one material completely replaces another. They succeed because the right compromise arrives at the right moment. So what are we really watching? The beginning of Japan's comeback, or another invention the country creates, only for someone else to turn into an industry? So step back. Away from Japan, away from iodine, away from the panel itself. For 100 years, the electricity in your walls has been a traveler. It's born somewhere you'll never see. A power plant burning through the night, a field of panels in a desert, a dam holding back a river. And then it runs, down cables, across towers, over hundreds of miles of countryside just to reach the light above your head. We built a whole century around that one idea. That power is made somewhere far away and carried to you. This technology asks a quieter question. What if the surfaces already around you, the window beside you, the wall at your back, the side of the building across the street, could just make power right where you're standing? The breakthrough was never really a thinner solar panel. It was the idea that energy doesn't have to come from somewhere else. It can come from everywhere at once. There's another lesson hiding in this story. Inventing the future and building the future aren't always the same thing. History is full of brilliant ideas that changed the world, but only after someone else figured out how to scale them. The future doesn't always belong to the country that invents first. It belongs to the one that turns an invention into part of everyday life. Whether that country is Japan this time is still an open question, but the question itself may end up changing how all of us think about where energy comes from.